Hello, everybody. Hi. I like how excited you all are. Welcome. Good evening and welcome to Amazing Brains. I'm so pleased that you could join us, whether it's in person or whether you are joining from your sofa at home. Hello, everybody on the cameras. Hi. I'm Victoria Broom, actor, obviously, noticing the camera straight away, from BBC's Cheaters or Netflix Marcella and other bits and pieces that you might have seen. But if you haven't seen those two shows, do, because they're awesome. And not just because I'm in them, they're actually really good shows. I am absolutely delighted to be hosting this wonderful event this evening. My family have experienced firsthand the life-changing impact of stroke. My grandmother sadly had 2 strokes. After the first, she, like 3/4 of stroke survivors in the UK, experienced mental health difficulties. Now, I want to chat a little bit about my gran, Louisa Gwilym. She was the least likely person that we thought would suffer from a stroke. She was active, healthy, loving life. Stroke had never affected my family before, but we'd Googled it and we saw that there was mobility issues, there was speech issues after stroke, but something that we weren't expecting or ready for was depression. My gran went from somebody who loved life, loved learning, always happy, always answering the questions on eggheads and getting them right all the time, to being somebody that was sad, low, depressed. That change didn't just affect my gran, but also my mom. She watched her mother and best friend change after stroke. Stroke absolutely devastated my family, which is why I felt it was important to be here tonight with you all. As you will hear this evening, research is vital if we are to continue to support stroke survivors on their mental health journeys after stroke. With the generosity of their wonderful supporters, like some of you here tonight, and some of you guys watching from home, I'm not going to forget you guys at home, the Stroke Association has invested over £55 million in stroke research since 1992. The charity's vision is to support people to rebuild their lives after stroke. So while they fund research on prevention and emergency treatment, the majority of the research they've supported has been in recovery and rehabilitation, such as those that you will hear about this evening on mental health research. Stroke research is vital in helping people recover from all of the effects of their stroke. Some of those effects are easily noticeable. However, there are many other effects that are just not so clear. Every stroke is different, which is why tailored support is absolutely crucial. But stroke research is underfunded, and we can't make the difference needed to help rebuild lives without the funds to put into research. None of what you will hear about tonight would have been possible without the time, effort, and generosity of every single one of you here tonight and you guys watching at home. So thank you. We have 4 fantastic speakers this evening. So later, we'll be hearing from Professor Mark Tarrant, Professor Maggie Lawrence, and Dr. Emma Patchwood, Stroke Association-funded researchers who will be sharing their work on mental health after stroke. But first, I'd like to introduce Jason Parker. Now, Jason is a stroke survivor himself and has bravely agreed to share with us this evening his own personal experience with mental health after his stroke. We are so grateful for Jason for sharing his story and sadly not an uncommon experience with us. So please, can I welcome Jason?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. So I'm Jason Parker. My day job is I'm a partner at KPMG. Don't say boo. Somewhat ironically, I look after a healthcare practice, and outside of that, I'm also chair of Bliss, the national neonatal charity for babies born too sick and too soon. So why am I here today? 2019, I had a stroke caused by an AVM, aged 45. I was fit. I had just come back from cycling across the Alps with a bunch of friends and raised loads of money for Bliss. And I was out in the garden one day raking some leaves and then just thought it was weird. I could see a football and yet I couldn't kick it. And then in seconds, minutes, I couldn't feel my leg, my feet, my arms, and I felt like my mouth was twitching and that kind of stuff. So I lost the left-hand side of everything, couldn't move anything. I was in a hoist, in a wheelchair for 3 months, and then in hospital for up to 7 months. There were less obvious stuff with it as well. So I noticed that I became very sensitive to noise and stuff like today. If this had been a year ago, 2 years ago, I would have found this overwhelming: noise, sensory overload, all that kind of stuff. And mental health was a challenge, and I'll come back to that in a sec. Other stuff I noticed was my wife is a consultant psychiatrist who is very good and grounding for me. She said, basically, my personality became myself on steroids, which is probably really irritating. So well, I know it's really irritating. So my day job is being a management consultant, which is irritating anyway. But what does that mean? It means I always know the answer to everything. I am super driven, want to get things done, want to make change happen, all that kind of stuff. And I'm quite judgy. So that's not great in every situation, but we'll come back to it. Some of that is great as you recover from a stroke. So I had 7 months to learn how to do everything again, to wiggle my toe and all that kind of stuff. At the time, the sort of conventional wisdom was around neuroplasticity, and I was told by my neurologist that the 6-month window is really, really important in your recovery. So sort of smash everything you can in that period of time, and then you're kind of done, was what I was told. So what you get back in 6 months, that'll be it. So if we go back to my personality and driven, want to get things done, cycling through the Alps, all a bit silly, I threw everything into recovery. So I was naughty. So on the hospital ward, I was the one who was sneaking around in my wheelchair when I should have been. I was getting out of my bed when I shouldn't be getting out of my bed. I was going to the gym and holding onto a rail as best I can to pull myself up, that kind of stuff. Asking the chief exec, who I actually knew, why is your gym closed on a weekend? And I was the only guy there on the stroke ward doing all of these things. Why do I say that? Because I think I have learned that 6-month window, I think, is not right. Because this is 3 years on now and I'm still making enormous progress. And there's a thing about probably mental state and determination that actually can make an enormous difference. Let me talk to you about care I received. I would say the acute care that I got was absolutely brilliant, from ambulance to assessment to being popped in a bed. My local hospital was all fantastic, and I have nothing but praise for my time there, which was brilliant. I love those guys, and I go back regularly to talk to patients and just share my experience on it and try and give people a bit of hope that look, I'm walking, you probably don't notice any difference in me now, which is great. I would compare that to what you get when you leave hospital and then you go into the community, and it is stark, the difference that you see. So technically everything was there. So day one, I am discharged. I'm still in a wheelchair, can't do much. There are ramps outside my house, and I've got the handles to help me get in the house and into the bath and all that kind of stuff. So tick, tick, tick. A succession of people came to see me that day to check on my mental health and to check on my rehab needs and all those kind of things. They all came with a checklist. I never saw anybody ever again. The checklist on mental health was almost hilarious in hindsight. So it was like, have you had suicidal thoughts? Yes, quite often recently. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I hope you feel better. For counselling, I had one counselling session who told me I should give up my job. I was 45. I'm a partner at a big 4 firm, blah, blah, blah. For me, it was a big deal to get back to working for loads of reasons. We can come back to that. But being told that actually everybody stops working when this happens, it's a massive blow. And it was like, really, I mean, she was lovely, but it was just that I did not need to hear that. I wanted hope at that point, and I did not get that. I thought carefully about privilege in all of this. So what did I do? Okay, so I'm a consultant. So going back to the beginning, what did I do? I tried to fix everything. So I was like, do you know what? I'll pay for all this myself. So I went out and I got rehab, I got counselling. My wife's a psychiatrist, helped me to navigate the system. So she got me gamma surgery, which wasn't discussed. I was just told to sort of go home and it should fix itself, or it might pop again, who knows, in a number of years' time. So I understand healthcare because that's my day job. So I was able to navigate the system, had the means and resources to be able to get what I needed to. And I often wonder, did that significantly affect my outcome? Probably. But some of that is about determination and mental state. Some of that is about resource. And I think it's really poor that we have people who are discharged from the hospital after receiving wonderful treatment, then being kind of left at home. I mean, what sort of life is that? It's pretty poor. To turn to mental health, I had a lot of time to think about this stuff. So you sat in a hospital bed, you can't really move. I wondered whether I would be able to work again. I wondered whether I wanted to work again. I had new perspective. You know, you look back and thinking, well, why on earth did I used to get stressed about X, Y, and Z? But I did realize it was important to me. And so I added that focus to, do you know what, I'm going to go back to work. And so there was no changing my mind. I was going back. And ideally after 3 months, and everyone was just laughing at me, saying, this is ridiculous. People take years to recover from this. But I was kind of on a mission to do that kind of stuff. So I went back after 7 months full-time to KPMG as a partner. And it was probably a ridiculous thing to do, quite frankly. I was completely blagging it. I had terrible fatigue. I was struggling with sensory stuff. And teams had just come in, so COVID had just started, and I was all over the place. But I didn't show anyone. I didn't want anybody to see weakness, but it was there. In turn, I'm also certain that has significantly improved my recovery. So I was kind of putting myself out there and always trying to go and push myself into new things has, I think, made me recover much quicker than I would have done before. So I would not advise anyone to go back after 7 months. But I would advise people to not change your goals in life, etc., because you've had a setback like this. In terms of mental health, what did I feel? I think a range of things. So yes, there was a bit of sort of suicidal stuff, and I'd say that was, not a, of course it is a big deal, but it was not a frequent thing. There was an occasional, do you know what, this is awful. My 5-year-old was there with me. I don't want her to see me like this. But not all the time. And a lot of anxiety. Some of that was logical. So it was, you have had something pop in your head. It was an AVM. Is this going to happen again? Nobody could tell me that. So that is on your mind all the time. Mortality, is this going to happen again? Some of it became quite illogical. So it's approaching the 1-year anniversary on my stroke. Therefore, I probably will have another stroke on December the 9th. And honestly, for about 2 months before that, I was like, December's coming. And that's really logical, and almost no amount of counselling can help you with that. But you kind of need to know when you're talking to people who've had stuff like this, because your emotions are up and down all the time. I often describe it as like big weather systems coming in that you can see coming, but they come really fast. So whether it's anxiety, depression, these things come and go really quickly in a way that they didn't before. So there's a bit of theological stuff. I think my self-esteem was like really rocked. So I would think you would all be judging me, or that you could see that there's something wrong with me. And I still kind of think that. So coming to talk to you today, a bit of me is a lot more nervous than I would have been 3 or 4 years ago doing something like this, because I keep thinking, can I do it? Because the old me would have done this all the time. And the new me, oh God, because I've got all these things to think about or worry about. And then I'm looking at the step going, I hope I don't trip on the step. Will there be a handrail? All that kind of stuff. I don't need a handrail. You know, my daughter, yeah, there's nothing like kids to give you feedback, is it? She goes, Dad, why do you go down the stairs holding the rail like an old man? I'm like, because I think I'm probably more of an old man than I used to be. And then I realized it was a comfort thing. It's like, I had to lean over there just in case I fell. And she goes, right, walk down the stairs without, and just got me into a regime of just kind of doing that kind of stuff. But actually, the self-esteem is a struggle. And when you go back to work, you've got all that 10, 20-fold. You're like, oh, is everybody staring at me? What do I look like on Teams? Is everybody walking on eggshells around me? All that kind of stuff. So all that stuff is whirring around your head, along with trying to do your day job and all the rest of it. So you've got all of that stuff that's going on. And then there's something about getting used to disability. So it was weird getting a blue badge. So DVLA said I was able to drive again after speaking to GP, all that kind of stuff, but I got a blue badge and I was like shocked to see this thing, because I did not think myself to be disabled. And then the sort of badge that comes with the badge, if you see what I mean, the sort of stigma that comes with all of that is really interesting. How people look at you when you park your car, what they say to you when you park your car, because there is a strange logic in Britain, which is if you park in a disabled space and you have a car, you are therefore a benefits cheat. So I have been called, I won't say it because we're on, I've been called all kinds of things in Sainsbury's car park because I have a car. And so there's something about you're not allowed a job and be disabled. So there's got all of this strange thing that you're having to get used to. I've learned to laugh at all of that stuff, and I've learned to be comfy talking about disability at work and all that kind of stuff. But again, you would never think that you would have to also start to think about that. And you've got a definition on yourself, which is a bit of a judgment of, I am disabled, I am a stroke survivor. I'm not sure I quite like the phrase, all those kind of things. I'm still me. But you've got these labels on you, which then in turn, you see that other people look at you with those labels. So even at KPMG, who are lovely and were amazing with me when I was off and all that kind of stuff, I'm still the guy they go to on World Disability Day, because I'm like, I'm vaguely affable. I can talk without falling over. Tick, he does the disability bit. So, I mean, they're all lovely people, but it's a bit of a judgment thing that Jason can talk about disability. I can talk about lots of other things, and I'm happy to talk about lots of that, and I'm still happy to do that stuff. It's completely fine, because actually the more we talk about it, I think that the better it is. I was asked about family, and I mustn't cry. It's really hot. There's something about you don't realize it's as hard for them as it is for you. So they're walking on eggshells around you the whole time. My wife was brilliant. My son got an eating disorder. And my little one was hilarious, actually. My little one was 4 at the time. I got a call from the school to say that she'd kicked the head teacher. Right in the shins. She didn't say, Mrs. Kenny called me and said, yes, Scarlett is normally a lovely child, but she kicked me in the shins. She didn't say anything. She pulled her face and left. It turns out she wasn't happy that her dad was in hospital. And so you've got all this stuff going on, and you're consumed in your own stuff, and the support you get is incredible. So I can never repay them enough. So where am I today? Try and finish on a chirpier note. So I think really good. The gamma knife surgery I had, so I was in Queen Square with Mr. Kitchen in May 2020, had that, and then you don't know the outcome of that until you have a angio 2 or 3 years later. I now have in my downstairs loo a letter from Mr. Kitchen that says my AVM has been obliterated and to get on with enjoying my life, which is brilliant. I can kind of stumble around a 10K run, and then I come in moaning about that, and my wife says, at least you can run 10K. I can get on my bike and do all that kind of stuff. I went skiing. I fell over about 8 times, but I still did it. Going back to the pushing myself to things that, always pushing myself into new stuff. And I'm still getting better. So that 6-month window thing, it'd be really interesting if there's more research on how is it for people beyond that 6-month period, because I think my stuff is getting better and better. It's still getting better. I filmed a lot of the stuff and put it on Twitter when I was going through it, because I was bored, didn't know what to do. And then like 1 million people started watching videos of me stumbling around a ward. Because apparently not many people, when they film this stuff, when you're actually going through it, especially at a younger age. And so I get all of these messages going, oh, you're an inspiration, it's marvelous. I don't buy that at all. Like, it's nice that people say nice things. I don't feel it. I feel like I wish this had never happened to me. Of course I do. And I mourn my previous self because, and I think probably for the first year afterwards, I spent the time battling against my former self. So it's like, I'm going to show you that I'm exactly the same person I was before, perhaps even better. Maybe I'll run a 10K faster than I did before. All those sorts of impossible bars I had set myself. And it took quite a long time to realize that A, I had a blue badge, B, I wasn't going to be able to do all of those things. But actually, I ticked off a list of what do I like doing and all that kind of stuff and what is possible. And there's pretty much nothing I can't do now. My little one tells me and laughs in my face at me. She arranges an obstacle course outside and I've got her over 100 meters. Like, I can smash her by 50 meters, and I enjoy that because I'm competitive, right? She's clocked that if she sets up an obstacle course outside in the garden, I'm not so good going left to right, left to right, left to right, picking up a hoop, all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't matter, does it? So there's a lot that I can't do, but I've turned that around from what I can't do to what I can do, which is great. And I have perspective on everything. And I think I've learned to apply that sort of competitive, horrible management consultant behavior to kind of just recovering and continuing to recover. And so if I can help anybody through my story, through my journey, I am really happy to do that. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason. I think it's safe to say that you are an inspiration, Jason. So thank you very much for being here tonight. The Stroke Association is the only charity funding research into stroke. And that's why research projects, such as the ones that you will hear about this evening, are so crucial to helping stroke survivors rebuild their lives after stroke. So let's now hear from our first researcher, Professor Mark Tarrant. So Mark is Associate Professor of Psychology Applied to Health at the University of Exeter Medical School. And tonight he'll be telling us about the links between social connections and mental health. Please welcome Mark.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and of course to the organisers of this fantastic event to come and speak today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I recently asked one of my student groups to tell me in a few words how they would describe themselves. This is the answers that they gave me, and I think there's a few things that we could probably pull out of this really simple exercise. First thing that I would note is that, like many of us, students describe themselves in many different ways. The other thing that I would pull out from this is that actually the way that students, and again many of us, describe ourselves is in relation to social categories, social category memberships or social group memberships. And a wealth of research now in my area of psychology has established the importance of group membership and seeing oneself in terms of a group membership for how we make sense of ourselves and how we make sense of the world around us. But a growing body of research also shows us that those group memberships and the connections that we form to people in group settings is fundamentally important to our health. And that's what my talk and my research with the support of the Stroke Association has been about. And it's not all about me, of course. I have a strong sense of identity as a stroke researcher, as do other people in our team across Exeter and elsewhere. So we are a varied bunch of academics, also clinicians involved in the work that we do, and also, of course, patients. And Jane Adamson here, who has been working with us on our projects for a number of years now. It's been absolutely fantastic to have her involvement in it. If I ask this question of people, or my students, or us, what impacts our health, or what are the main things that determine mortality, most people tend to reference these things around the outside as physical or behavioral characteristics, stuff that we do. But some really fascinating research a few years ago now by Holt Lunstead and colleagues turned that assumption very much on its head. And what their research did was to pool lots of previous studies on this topic, what impacts mortality. What they demonstrated is that the number one thing that impacts mortality is not the physical or behavioral things. Actually, it's about social relationships, and it's about connections. That's the number one predictor of mortality across something like 300,000 people. Of course, if you discuss that with somebody who's experienced a stroke, that is absolutely not a surprise to them. So we know, and stroke survivors don't regularly talk about their stroke as being a life-shattering event, not just in terms of its impact on physical health, but also its impact on broadly psychosocial health, or mental, including mental health. And these psychosocial variables or issues have a clear impact on people's relationships, both in terms of people's ability to maintain previous connections that they formed, previous groups that they may have belonged to, be those work groups or any other groups, but also impacts on their ability to grow new group memberships as well, to make new lasting connections. The importance of being able to do that has been highlighted in research directly with stroke survivors as well. And so this work by Professor Kath Haslam and colleagues at the University of Queensland in Australia demonstrated that being able to reconnect or maintain connections with some of those groups that we previously belonged to is really important in terms of predicting people's satisfaction with life after their stroke. So reconnecting stroke survivors then is an absolute priority for research. And of course, stroke survivors tell us that as well. And my research, our research, and the two projects that I'm going to talk about now is very much about that issue of social connection. The impetus for much of our work has come from stroke survivors. We started talking, when we embarked on some of this research, we started talking with people who have experienced stroke in order to better understand their needs and their priorities, to understand what they thought research should be addressing. And the clear issue for stroke survivors is about social rehabilitation, addressing those psychosocial challenges that they commonly face. And this was really brought home to me by a stroke survivor who said to me, actually, what I want to be able to do, I kind of come to terms with the physical challenges of my condition, but actually what I want to be able to do is to go down to the corner shop on my own and buy a loaf of bread. I want to be able to do that independently. And that's about socialization and reconnecting with society. So our research has all been about understanding that issue, and also understanding what we might be able to do about that from an intervention perspective. So there's two projects that we have completed now, both supported with funding from the Stroke Association. I'm just going to highlight some of the key issues from these two studies. So the first project then is one that we refer to as the COGS project, Community Groups for Post-Stroke Support. And this project was looking at stroke survivors' experiences of two key psychosocial health outcomes, loneliness and well-being. But we were also interested in how stroke survivors' membership of a stroke support group across the country, of which there are almost in the region of 400 now nationally, we're interested in how their experiences of those groups might contribute to these health outcomes, how it might help them. So we did this work, started this work before the pandemic, but we've also conducted some work during the pandemic to understand perhaps how those experiences and those group experiences may have changed, potentially as a consequence of the pandemic. So just very quickly, this is the findings from the pre-pandemic work that we did. As I think we all know, loneliness is a major problem for many stroke survivors, much higher prevalence of loneliness in the stroke population than in the population of people that haven't had a stroke. And that was very much replicated here. But what we found is that people's experience of loneliness actually was shaped in part by their membership of a stroke support group. What was particularly important was whether they felt a sense of connection to other people in that group. If they didn't feel connected to that group, then that was clearly associated with higher levels of loneliness. But if they did feel a sense of social connection, if they identified with their peer support group, then that was associated both with lower levels of loneliness and better health or greater well-being as we measured it. So the message then clearly coming out of this first part of this study was that groups matter. Stroke support groups matter for stroke survivors. So we ran this study again during about 3 months or so into the pandemic. I think we were all expecting actually to see a downturn in people's psychosocial health. We expected loneliness to be worse and well-being to be worse. But that wasn't the case. It was actually pretty much the same as it was prior to the pandemic. So this is an indication of some resilience, if you like. What we also found, also indicating resilience, is that when we asked them about their experiences of their peer support group and their connections to those groups, their experiences, their perceived connection to the group was about the same as it was beforehand. The really interesting thing about that, I think, is that this was despite the lockdown that we were in. The groups stopped. They couldn't meet in person anymore, but nonetheless, people that we spoke to in this work maintained that sense of psychological connection to those people. And they also, as we saw, shifted their behavior to allow them to maintain contact, meaningful contact in other ways. And it's probably a bit small, but they did what everybody else did. They moved away, of course, from in-person, but to more telephone calls, perhaps some more video conferencing, opportunities to maintain those connections. That was so important, wasn't it, to everybody to maintain and look for ways to maintain those connections in really quite challenging circumstances for everybody. So groups matter, and they matter even in the absence of being able to connect in person. We followed some of this work up with interviews with a group of stroke survivors just to explore in a little bit more depth what was the experience really like for them as a group member. And they very much talked about how those groups were fundamentally important to their rehabilitation, their psychosocial rehabilitation. So they talked about the importance of being able to connect to people, coming to realize that you're not on your own, even though you might have slightly different experiences, slightly different symptoms, actually there's a lot in common. And that was described as very reassuring by the people that we spoke to. They also talked about the groups as being an important basis for them to start rebuilding their lives in terms of it being, the groups being a motivating factor, but also a basis for them to develop self-efficacy and confidence to make changes, to try out new things, to go back to some of the things that they were doing previously, to run that 10K, for example. So groups matter, and they matter because they provide the basis for people to rebuild their lives. They provide a tangible resource or access to tangible resources that are important for people to address the psychosocial challenges that they have. So that was the COG study. Let me just move on then, just the last few minutes, just to talk about the second program of work. And this is a program of work which tested an intervention, a new intervention that we developed, which was aimed at people who have aphasia after stroke, which we know is a somewhat neglected population when it comes to research. The impetus for this project, like our other work, has very much been from stroke survivors themselves. We were approached about 10 years ago now when we started this project. We were approached by a person with aphasia who asked this seemingly straightforward question: does group singing help people with aphasia? The answer is probably not as straightforward as we hoped it might be. There were no answers when we embarked on this journey. So we put together our team and we developed and designed a new intervention with important input from stakeholders, including speech and language therapists, patients, and also academics like myself. And we developed what we call the Singing for People with Aphasia group intervention. It's a 10-week intervention, principally focused on supporting people to connect, with the objective being that this will help them to develop the confidence that they need in order to continue to rebuild their lives after a stroke. It's a two-phase project. The first phase involved a pilot trial, an embedded process evaluation. Second phase we haven't started yet. We're seeking funding for that currently, and that's to conduct a definitive trial to answer that question conclusively: does this work? What I'm just going to share with you for a minute or two that I've got left is some of the really, I think, interesting work about the processes that is going on here when we run these groups. It's very much about the mechanism by which these groups might be functioning. So we ran the program, the group singing program, in 3 different groups in the southwest of the UK, and we video recorded every group session. There's a lot of video material. Thankfully, we have access to some fabulous students who are enthusiastic also about stroke research, and we trained some of them to code the videos. We chopped the videos into segments and we randomized them to make it hard for them to predict what we thought might happen. We asked them to code the videos. We trained them to code the videos in terms of the degree of exhibited connectedness shown by the group as a whole. And what we found, as you can see here on this figure, was a steady but clear increase in exhibited connectedness, what we term shared social identity, across the 10-week session. This was really important finding for us to be able to document that this intervention is doing what we wanted it to do. The fundamental goal for this intervention was to connect people, to have people to come to the group and over time develop that sense of connection, for all the reasons that the COGS study was articulating. So we're now ready to move this to provide a definitive test of the impact of this intervention on psychosocial health. So just to very quickly wrap up now, these 2 programs of work, I hope, have demonstrated for you the importance of groups in stroke recovery, particularly for psychosocial health. It comes with a bit of a warning, and that is about there's a need for us to better understand how do we make this happen in practice, because we've probably all been in a group from time to time where we think this group is not for me. Yeah. Or you're in a group which starts off for you and then it goes in a different direction. So it's a bit of a balancing act. So questions for us is about what do we have to do to keep the group in good balance? And there are aspects there about organizational things, but there are also aspects of facilitation. What do the people that run the groups need to do in order to reliably connect people. So that's the focus of our ongoing research. So just lastly then, stroke groups are important to stroke survivors. They're an important basis for stroke survivors to reconnect with society. It's also a safe environment for them. They very much talk about that as an opportunity, groups as an opportunity to help get your life back on track. So if we do it well, if we can learn and understand how to do it reliably, I think the main message here is that social connectedness through groups can be a powerful resource to support people in their rehabilitation after stroke. Thank you very much.
That was a fascinating talk, so thank you so much for that. Just so you all know, we are actually holding a Q&A once we've heard from all of our researchers and from Jason as well. So please do think of some questions that you want to ask at the end, okay? Now, let's welcome our next speaker, Professor Maggie Lawrence. So Maggie is Professor in the Department of Nursing and Community Health at the Glasgow Caledonian University. Tonight, she will be telling us about her journey as a researcher and about Heads Up, her current project on mindfulness to support mental health after stroke. So please welcome Maggie.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to the Stroke Association for organising tonight and giving me this opportunity to talk to you about the Heads Up programme of research that I've been leading for a few years now. Heads Up, I'll explain a bit more later, but it stands for Helping Ease Anxiety and Depression After Stroke. I'm going to talk briefly for the next few minutes about my research journey and how important funding from organisations such as the Stroke Association has been to making that career happen. I'll briefly have a revisit. We've already heard about the impacts of stroke from Jason and from Mark, but I'll talk about that briefly and then spend a lot of time focusing on the Heads Up project and in particular letting you hear from the people who took part in that research. So my journey in stroke research, actually I realise now began a step before this. I did a funded PhD study that was funded by the Chief Scientist Office in Scotland. And that was about young adults who had a stroke. And one of the big findings from that study was that young adults were afraid of having another stroke, as Jason has alluded to. And there was also this big issue around the anniversary of stroke and the fear being particularly strong then. But young adults also frequently wanted to know how to not have another stroke if they could. What could they do? And they knew that they needed to maybe change lifestyle, so maybe to be more physically active or to drink less alcohol or whatever. But they didn't necessarily know how best to go about that. And if they did, they didn't always find it very easy. So off the back of that PhD work, I then applied for a Stroke Association Senior Research Training Fellowship. And the intention of that was to develop a family-centred intervention that would help people of all ages to make healthy changes after a stroke. And the outcome of that work was actually a module on a website called Self-Help for Stroke, which is a bit similar to the My Stroke Guide that you'll probably be familiar with that the Stroke Association produced. So there's a module on there called Keeping Well, which is about healthy lifestyles. But we also realised that if people are going to make changes like that, that they maybe have been doing things like drinking too much alcohol, or if you're me, eating too many donuts when you're stressed. So what do we do to help people not do that? We can't just say to them, you need to stop eating donuts, you need to stop drinking alcohol, it's not good for you. We need to help them find other ways of coping with stress and anxiety and the stresses of daily life. So with that learning, I then went on to think about mindfulness as a potential thing that people could do that didn't cost much money once you'd learned it, that you could do anywhere. You didn't need a gym membership, you didn't need expensive equipment. It was just something that you could learn to do and maybe draw on whenever you needed it. So we had funding again, this time from the Chief Scientist Office, and that was for development research. So we took a standard mindfulness-based stress reduction program and we adapted it to make it more accessible for people who'd had a stroke. And then once we'd done the development work, and during that study we worked with people who'd had a stroke and with family members of people who'd had a stroke, we then applied to the Stroke Association, who had a priority call out for psychological research following stroke. And we wanted to test the course that we had now developed to see whether or not people liked it, could they do it, did they stick with the 9 weeks, and very importantly, were they able to keep practicing mindfulness when the course had finished. So during all those funded projects, these were keeping me in a job, if you like. They were helping me develop as a researcher, and they were helping me be promoted and continue to raise awareness and continue to work in the field of stroke research. So all of those funding pots were really fundamental to what I was doing and to hopefully the outcomes that we've seen improving things for some people who've had a stroke. Mark's already mentioned this, and it was certainly Jason's experience, is that stroke comes out of the blue. People don't expect it. They tend not to have very obvious warnings of it coming on, and it can have quite devastating and immediate impacts. We've heard from our previous speakers as well that having a stroke can impact the relationships that you have with other people. And from Stroke Association surveys, we've learned that almost half of the people who have a stroke probably experience a disruption in their relationship with their family members, like their spouse or a partner. And 1 in 4 people will talk about these kind of negative impacts on their wider family and social networks. Jason interestingly mentioned this issue around employment, and there's a lot of data that tells us people don't go back to work after stroke for lots of reasons, or if they were unemployed, then they tend not to become employed after stroke. And the same applies to education. If we look more widely at the cost to society, estimates are that it can cost £26 billion a year. And this includes things like lost tax income revenue from people not being employed and the actual health and social care costs. So we know there's a big problem after stroke around mood disorder, as we call it, so particularly anxiety and depression. But we also know that services are patchy and that not everybody has access to the service they need at the time they need it, or possibly for long enough. So out of this kind of background came the idea for Heads Up. So Heads Up, as I've said, stands for Helping Ease Anxiety and Depression After Stroke. It's based on a standard mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is a structured course that lasts for 8 or 9 weeks and requires people to practice the skills that they learn on that course, as you would with any course that you were learning skills on, and to continue practicing that in the long term. This was developed way back in the 80s by John Kabat-Zinn and has been widely researched, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's effective for lots of conditions and for lots of different types of people. So there was no reason to think that it wouldn't be effective in stroke, but what we did want to do was to make sure that it was more accessible for people. So as I've already mentioned, there was a sort of program of work. There was the development work in which we worked with people affected by stroke, where we made the changes to make the Heads Up course, well, to develop the actual Heads Up course and to make the materials more accessible. We then took on the work that we've just finished, which was in 2 parts and was funded by the Stroke Association. So in the first part, we asked groups of people to do a mindfulness course, to do Heads Up, and then to tell us what they thought about it in focus groups and questionnaires afterwards. So we did that face-to-face, and then COVID happened, so we had to do it all again online, because the next stage was for us to test it in different groups of people and with bigger numbers. So 62 people took part in an online research project. A randomized controlled trial essentially means that all our participants were randomly split into 2 groups, and one of the groups would get Heads Up and the other group didn't. And everybody was asked to do questionnaires throughout the study and to take part in focus groups to tell us about their experiences. So that work has literally just come to an end, and we are just writing up and reporting that. And these are the people that I've worked with to do this research. So Dr. Bridget Davis, I've been working with her since 2017, and she's now Senior Research Fellow and was Project Manager for the Heads Up randomized controlled trial. Naomi Clark was a researcher on that project. She has a psychology background, and she's now gone on to do her PhD looking at what can we do to support people's practice in the long term once they've finished a mindfulness course. Matilda Pieri is a speech and language therapist from Italy. She's undertaking a PhD that's also funded by the Stroke Association by our project grant. And she's looking at making Heads Up even more accessible, if you like. She's looking at adapting the material for people who have aphasia, who, as Mark said, are quite often a group that are ignored in stroke research. And then Leila De Amicis worked with us on the development work, and she also has a background in psychology. So you can see not only has the money from the Stroke Association benefited my career journey, but it's also supporting 2 early career researchers at the start of their journeys. And Bridget is continuing to work in stroke research as well. Here are the people that we work with. We've worked with people who've had a stroke and with family members of people who've had a stroke in a range of capacities over the years. So some have acted as advisors, some have taken part in a panel of experts, for example. Many people have taken part as participants over the years, and some people are also members of our applicant group for further funding. And in the last stage of the research, people have also been overseers of the quality of the research that we've been carrying out. So now, hopefully, it's time to hear from the people who've taken part in the research. No, that didn't happen. Here we go. So in the feasibility study, we're really looking to ask the people who take part in the course, which is part of a research project, we're asking them to tell us what they thought about the actual course, so what they thought about Heads Up, but we also need to know what they thought about the research process. So the things we were asking them to do, which was like fill out questionnaires about their mental health and to take part in things like the focus group we've had today.
The whole team are very easy to talk to. Bridget works like a Trojan. So we decided, phoned up one of the people in the college. We had a screening process and we decided we'd give it a bash to see how it would be. Bridget came out and interviewed me, and then we did what was known as questionnaires, which I answered as best I could.
So the learning that we have from these things will then help us to maybe make changes to the design of the pilot study which comes next autumn.
They just always get time for you. You could ask them anything. They make it easy to come here, and that's a huge thing for somebody who's had a stroke.
And there's always somebody there, and they've always got a word. You're welcomed when you come. They sit with you at tea break and all the rest of it, and you always get a fond farewell. A good greeting and a fond farewell.
So that's a little insight into what it's like for people who've had a stroke to actually be involved in a research project. And these are some of the people who took part in the first the face-to-face version of Heads Up that we did. So as well as telling us about what it was like to actually take part in the research, they've also reflected on the impact of doing the course on them and on their families.
I actually think I'm a different person now. I think my husband will vouch for that too. I don't go on to him as much, but I feel more relaxed with having done it. And if you get sort of uptight, you can just calm yourself down with your breathing.
So yeah, I do have my anxious moments, but I feel I can actually deal with them. And if it hadn't been for mindfulness, I'd have been swimming against the tide. And I swam against the tide for a good, that's what, 8.5 months until I got to this course. This is going to be the tool set that I'll use for both myself and for Anne for the rest of our life. Whenever we think there's going to be any event or any anxiety or stress, I now have this tool set that I can use and say, this will help me manage and control any anxiety or stress.
And I can honestly say after the 9 weeks, it has just changed me as a person, which I didn't think was possible. It's given me some belief in myself back again, and some confidence.
Okay, so finally, we did ask these same participants if they would make videos that we could use to recruit to future studies. So this clip here is specifically about that. It's about talking to people who might be interested in taking part in research, but are not quite sure. So let's give this a try. No? Yeah.
You're going to be wary. You're going to have that panic moment. I'm going in amongst all these people. What's it going to be like? What am I going to talk to people? Am I going to be sat there and just listen and be a dummy? And it ends up, you're there for 9 weeks. And by the 3rd week, I started to get what it was about.
Any apprehensions that I had at the start of it have been totally put to bed, because when I look around the room at the rest of the participants, it's been amazing the difference it's made to them. And I sincerely hope that more people who have suffered from strokes get the opportunity to participate in this course.
I would recommend it to anybody. Go and try it, because if it's not for you, stop it, but give it a good try. Do it for 3 weeks and take it in.
I kind of thought, will this do anything for me? And I can honestly say after the 9 weeks, it has just changed me as a person, which I didn't think was possible. So I would recommend that if anyone even had the slightest thought of doing it, give it a try. Just go and give it a try and see what you think, or speak to someone who's done it, because it is absolutely fabulous.
So what next for Heads Up? As we heard George say, I hope everyone gets the opportunity to try Heads Up. It makes a real difference to people's lives. But what's needed for that is support for a much bigger research study, and for that we need funding. And that's why nights like this are so important. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Just for the people at home, if people did want to get in contact with you about Heads Up, how would they find out about that?
Probably Googling.
Google Heads Up. There we go. Nice and easy. Good old Google. So now for the last of our research talks this evening, I'd like to welcome Dr. Emma Patchwood. Emma is a Stroke Association funded research fellow at the University of Manchester. She leads the wellbeing after stroke study on a group therapy that aims to help with depression and anxiety after stroke. So let's please welcome Emma.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone at home and in the room, of course, but everyone online as well. I'm really honoured to be here to highlight some of the many ways that Stroke Association research is supporting mental health after stroke. And I wanted to thank the donors, both in the room and online. I really hope that we inspire you to keep supporting stroke research. Oh, there we go. Right, so I am a research psychologist based up in Manchester. I've been working in stroke research and brain injury since 2006. And I have a long-standing partnership with the Stroke Association. They have funded my PhD that started back in 2011. And they have either directly or indirectly funded all of the postdoctoral work that I've done. So essentially, the last 12 years of work that I've done wouldn't have been possible without Stroke Association funding. So I'm very, very proud to be here as an ambassador for them tonight. I'm going to be talking a lot about teamwork and collaboration tonight. Teamwork really does make the dream work, as everyone said already. And I'm not going to be able to mention everyone that I work with, but I really did want to give a special mention to Professor Audrey Bowen, who I've worked with very closely since the start of my research career. Anyone who knows Audrey knows that she's a fantastic person and researcher, and I'm very grateful to call her my colleague and my friend. So thank you for everything, Audrey. Please don't cry. Okay, so who am I? Well, this is just an excuse to show you some cute baby pictures of me. This is exactly the response I wanted to garner in the room to help me feel slightly less nervous and discombobulated up here. So I wanted to share a story with you about my childhood. Growing up, we lived next door to an elderly guy named Frank. And I didn't know this at the time when I was a kid, but Frank was a stroke survivor. He could still walk, but his speech, his mood and his thinking was really severely affected. And I'm really ashamed and sad to admit this, but as a child, Frank used to scare me. And when he came up, because I couldn't make sense of him. So when he used to come over for help from my mum and dad, I'd just run away from him and I'd just go and get my mum and dad. And for me, I mean, it makes me feel really sad, but also it just raises, says how important it is to raise awareness of these issues and improve support for these kind of hidden consequences of stroke that are very prevalent and absolutely devastating. So now that I'm far from being that cute little kid, what do I do for work? Well, I try to do very applied research that is often about how do we improve long-term support for people after stroke. As we've heard tonight, the stroke recovery journey is years, not months. So that often means doing or working towards large-scale pieces of research that generate robust evidence to help us understand what's clinically and cost-effective so that we can improve services and actually really have an impact. I also try to deal with do some capacity building. So that's working with potentially new generations of stroke researchers. That usually comes through supporting postgraduates in their masters and their PhD students. And here are some of the wonderful students that I have had the pleasure of working with. And I'm going to hammer this one. Collaboration. I am definitely not an island. I work with some fantastic researchers, clinicians, service providers, and really importantly, service users. And I want to spend a bit of time saying more about that. So it's been really pivotal for all the work that I've done over the years. And here are just some of the stroke survivors and carers that I've had the pleasure of working with. There are many different ways of trying to get stroke survivors' voices in research. And it's key to all the research that I've done is that we've tended to set up these dedicated study-specific groups of people affected by stroke who we meet with regularly. They become our collaborators and our colleagues. They help us design and deliver the work that we do. They help us understand the data that we collect, interpret our findings, and tell others about what we do as well. And this kind of working with stroke survivors, like working with any specialists, because they are specialists, they are experts by experience. It takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of time and energy to do this well. But it really has great rewards. And when we listen to stroke survivors' voices in research, it really changes what we do and the way that we do it. And Stroke Association really get this. They know that this isn't about tokenism. It's not just about sort of asking for some opinions and then not really changing what you do. And that's one of the many reasons why I like working with Stroke Association as a funder. So now I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the research that I've done, that wouldn't have been possible without stroke survivors as collaborators and Stroke Association as funders. So there's a broad variety of things that we've done over the years. We've developed tools and processes to help us measure outcomes, measure what matters to people when we're trying to understand if a rehab intervention or some support that we've provided has actually been effective from the point of view of the people that we're trying to help. Now, that might seem really obvious, but it's not always done in clinic or in research. And actually, understanding and measuring whether something has been effective is really tricky science. We've also done some work around post-stroke reviews. So clinical guidelines tell us that we should be seeing people at regular intervals after stroke, 6 weeks, 6 months, and annually thereafter, and be asking them, what needs do you have? How have they changed? What support can we give you to meet those needs? But there wasn't really much guidance around how we should be doing these reviews and what we should be asking. So research led by people like Pippa Terrell and other fantastic people that I can't even think about now because I'm nervous. I've supported this work to look at, to develop something called the Greater Manchester Stroke Assessment Tool, or GMSAT. And that is essentially a toolkit that provides professionals with a way of doing these reviews in a very holistic and patient-centered way. And it's now one of the most widely used tools nationally for delivering post-stroke reviews. Again, wouldn't have been possible without Stroke Association funding. We've also done big research, big trials around how we best identify and support the needs of informal caregivers. These are people who are often doing a lot of labour after stroke, as we've heard from Jason, but their needs are often neglected. And so we've done big work in that area, which I won't have time to get into, but all of our research findings, our tools and our processes, we make sure that they're freely available online. So I'm happy to talk to people after this, but we want our findings to actually be used by you guys and have an impact. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now talking in a more depth about what we actually did and what we found on my latest piece of research called Waters, or Wellbeing After Stroke. So we've recently finished this piece of work, and we've circulated an easy access report on findings to all of our research participants and anyone else interested. And if you go to our YouTube channel, you can hear a reading of that report for anyone with accessibility needs. But why did we do the project? So as we've heard tonight, we often are quite poor at supporting mental health after stroke. And it tends to be that you have to be at a crisis point before we'll give you some support. You have to be clinically anxious or depressed. But wouldn't it be amazing if we could offer people some kind of intervention that helped them psychologically adjust to the inevitable suffering that stroke is likely to bring, and hopefully prevent a mental health crisis down the line? And supporting adjustment after stroke is the #1 research priority for life after stroke, according to organisations like the James Lind Alliance, who you may have heard of. But there's lots of challenges to doing this. And one of the things is that we don't have evidence-based interventions to support adjustment, and we don't have a workforce to provide these interventions. So that's where we started with Waters. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is a really promising psychotherapy in this space. ACT includes a lot of different tools and strategies to help people accept their reactions, their feelings and their emotions, and be present. So it does include mindfulness, as we heard about from Maggie, which is a really powerful tool. It's one of the tools in the ACT toolkit. It also helps people identify their core important values. What's really important for you to live a valuable life, and how can we help you move in a valued direction in your life, and how can we help you take action towards meaningful goals that are important for you. And one of the things that we're really trying to target in ACT research is something called psychological flexibility. This is the power to be resilient in the face of adversity, and hopefully ensure good mental health even when circumstances are changing and challenging. So there were a lot of different things we were trying to do in Waters, a lot of different work packages and questions that we had to ask. But we started with a development phase because we wanted to see, well, first of all, we set up a multidisciplinary team, that collaboration again, and a dedicated group of stroke survivors. And then we got to work to develop some stuff that we thought would be useful. So we wanted to develop this intervention that was based on ACT, that could be delivered to groups, because as we've heard from Mark, we know that groups have sometimes this added extra magic when it comes to well-being. So we wanted to look at group interventions based on ACT, and the pandemic happened whilst we were doing Waters as well. So then we had to think about, can it be remotely deliverable as well? Can we make ACT accessible and remotely deliverable so that we could work even though we couldn't see people in person? And we wanted to tackle this tricky issue of the workforce. So usually something like ACT would be delivered by clinical psychologists, but there's just not enough of them to reach people. And what's the point of having an intervention that works if we have no workforce that could actually reach communities and deliver it in practice? So then we wanted to say, ask the question of, can we upskill a willing and abundant workforce that would mean that we could have reach into the community if this proved to be effective. And then we moved to a testing phase, which was a sort of proof of principle kind of work to see whether anything like this was actually feasible for delivering in practice. So the questions we had here were, will stroke survivors actually want to take part in this? Can we recruit them? Can we retain them? Can we actually deliver these interventions with our trained staff, and can we deliver them to protocol as planned, and is it safe? Can we collect the necessary data that we would need to help us understand if something like this has been effective? And then what sort of feedback can we get from people to get a richer understanding of their experience of being involved in something like this, and how we make improvements and move forward to bigger research? So our co-development phase culminated in the Waters intervention and the workforce training program. So this is delivered over, the intervention itself for stroke survivors is delivered over 9 weekly sessions using Zoom video conferencing. The sessions themselves, there's a very detailed protocol for what a session looks like. They're highly structured. They involve all the components of ACT, but they are script informed. And the reason for that was to try to make sure that the groups were consistent, were replicable when we move forward. And also it had the added bonus of helping non-expert staff, people who hadn't experienced delivering ACT before. It had the benefit of helping them deliver it in a structured way. It also includes audio-visual resources and a client workbook to support engagement and accessibility as well. And it includes certain psychoeducation strategies for helping people deal with the common problems after stroke, like word finding problems, fatigue, forgetting, things like that. And then we moved on, once we developed it, we moved on to training our staff and then testing out the approach in practice. So in a nutshell, our testing phase, we ran 3 of these intervention groups with 12 stroke survivors and 1 carer between August and December 2021. And every group was facilitated by 2 different staff members, trained staff. We recorded all of our sessions to help monitor adherence and actually see, are we doing what we planned? We measured mood and well-being before and after groups, and then at 3 and 6 month time points as well, post intervention. And we also did interviews and focus groups to help us understand experiences more richly. And what I can tell you is that we had excellent attendance. We didn't have any dropouts. We had good response rates to our surveys, and we could deliver this intervention as planned and safely. But what more rich feedback did we get? Well, the staff told us they enjoyed really learning this approach. They found it time consuming, but they were highly motivated to deliver something like this because they really felt it'd be beneficial for stroke survivors. And their confidence in delivering this approach and their skills to deliver it really grew rapidly over time. And that bodes well for if you want to scale up this research. Stroke survivors found the groups acceptable and positive. It could be hard or upsetting at times to talk about their emotional well-being, but it was actually in being supported to talk about that the biggest breakthroughs could come and the perspective shifts that helped them actually feel better. And they usually gained something from the group, some kind of tool or strategy that they was using in their everyday life to improve their well-being. And they gave us, but staff and stroke survivors gave us a lot of feedback, constructive feedback about how we can improve this going forward to make it more accessible, think about when we offer this, how we deal with endings better, how we support group dynamics. I'll end on this quote, which really touched me. If it wasn't for the Waters study, I don't know where I'd be in my mental issues, mentally or physically. I'm pretty much out of time, but I'll just tell you that we're fairly confident that we managed to do everything that we set out to do and that we answered all our research questions. So in terms of what's next, well, we've got this intervention that we think has some good proof of principle that could help people psychologically adjust. And we want to move forward and test it further. And I'm really happy to say that we've got some funding to do this from the Stroke Association, no less. no less. I'm so happy that they're continuing to support wellbeing after stroke. So I'll say thank you for listening, and I'll leave you with this little message from two of our stroke survivors and Hannah Foote, our PhD student, to say,
thank you for supporting our research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. The work that you and all of the other researchers do is so important. And it's great to hear that you've secured funding from the Stroke Association to carry on with it. So well done. As I mentioned before, all of our speakers are now going to be taking part in a Q&A, so I hope you've got your questions ready. So I'd like to invite Jason, Mark and Maggie to come back on stage, and Emma as well. And I'm sure that they will be delighted to answer any of the questions that you might have on this hugely significant area of stroke. But before I say goodbye and pass over to the Stroke Association's CEO, Juliette Bouverie, for the Q&A and her closing remarks, I'd like to give my personal thanks to you all for being here tonight, for being so gentle with me and so quiet. So thank you so much. And for everybody logging in live at home, and to all of the organisers, Kate and Claire, who have been particularly by my side throughout this. So thank you guys, and thank you everybody. And over to Juliette.
So thank you so much, Victoria. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here tonight. It really has. So hello, everybody. Welcome to Amazing Brains. It's absolutely lovely to see you all here and to be together both online and face-to-face to celebrate stroke research. So thank you to our amazing speakers. So do you want to come up onto the platform again? And we're going to have a little Q&A. So I hope you're all getting ready with your questions. So I'm going to join our speakers. I'm going to get the conversation going with some questions from me to each of them. And then we'd love to hear from the audience. We have got a roving mic. So all you have to do is put your hands up, and then one of the team will come and plant the mic in your hands. So we'll start with a few questions from me. So I'm going to go to Emma first, if that's all right. That was dramatic. I don't know how that happened. So Emma, it's really great that you and Audrey Bowen, who's here, give us a wave, Audrey, have come back to us for further funding for Waters 2. So do you want to say a little bit more about what you're going to be doing in the next phase of your research?
Yeah, I'd love to. So Waters 2 is around taking what we've developed in Waters 1 and thinking about all the constructive feedback that we got from our staff and stroke survivors about how we can do this better before we move to a large scale project. You know, we don't want research waste. We want to make sure that we're doing something that's useful before we move forward into something like that. But one of the there's lots of things that we're going to look at in Waters 2, but there's a couple of real key things that I'll highlight here. So one of the things is that we're traditionally really poor at including people from different ethnic minority backgrounds in our stroke research. And we don't know why that is. We try to develop things that are accessible, that are inclusive, and we try to make them broadly appealing to people. But this is a consistent problem now. We seem to end up with, when we describe our sample, it's mostly white people, and it's just not good enough. So one of the things that we really want to do in Waters is to really make some meaningful connections with these Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities who are disproportionately affected by stroke, by the way, to say, how can we offer you mental health support that would appeal to you? Could an intervention like Waters be appealing to you? Can we make some tweaks to it, or do we just need to go back to the drawing board, that sort of thing? So we really want to make some adaptations to the intervention with these kind of communities in mind. And we also want to reach out to people with aphasia a bit more, because even though this isn't an aphasia intervention, we want to make it even more accessible for people with aphasia. And we also want to explore how, in terms of thinking about, because we always want to think about implementation into practice when we do research. And so how could we make this implementable? So looking at other workforces as well. So speaking to people within the NHS to say, how could this work? How could this be how could this be delivered if it proves to be effective? So those are the kind of things that we're looking at developing the intervention. And then we want to do some more testing, a bit like what you've heard about already, to sort of proof of principle testing with targeting these communities and these workforces as well.
Sounds fantastic, Emma. And actually, we were in a meeting earlier this week where we were talking about exactly that issue of the underrepresentation of Black and minority ethnic stroke survivors in research. That's really great. You're tackling that. Great. So, Jason, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, I could ask you a million questions, but I'm going to limit myself to one. I think one of the things that really struck me from what you said was when you said, I reframed from what I can't do to what I can do. And I suppose my question to you is, what helped you to do that reframing? And was there anything that the NHS could have done more of or differently to support you with that adjustment?
Good question. A bunch of counselling for sure, and a lot of long walks with friends and family to kind of think that through. I think some of it was just, it took time. I think it took 12 months to kind of accept what had happened, to be really honest, because I was like, no, I could probably turn back time because I'm a management consultant, I'll be able to do that. It turns out that wasn't possible. So I had to sort of get to an acceptance of who I was and what I had been through, and get to be able to talk about it without crying, which mostly I do apart from today, I promise you. And really try to get a more positive mindset, think about all the good things that I had in my life, all the good things I could do ahead of me, and that really changed my mindset.
Interesting. And what about the NHS, the role of the NHS?
There's a lot more they can do. I mean, not getting any access to counselling, etc., when something as traumatic as that has happened, I think is quite poor. And I think there's probably an age bit of this as well. I think people would, both in hospital and out of hospital, I think there was an assumption that I was in my 80s. So people would talk very loudly to check that I could hear properly, and I would go, I'm 40, I kind of understand what's going on, etc. So a bit of better understanding about people at different phases of their lives, from different backgrounds with different goals and all those sorts of things would be incredibly helpful.
Really interesting, really interesting. So Mark, if I could turn to you. I mean, we've heard tonight there's so many different approaches to managing mental health after stroke, talking therapies, peer support, medication, which we haven't even touched on tonight, and many more. So what do you think are the benefits and drawbacks of all these different alternatives?
Well, I'm not going to venture into anything about medication. That's definitely something that I know nothing about. But in terms of the other aspects that you talk about, for me, it's about giving people opportunities, and it's finding opportunities that people can embrace and are motivated to engage with. One of the paradoxes really of our Singing for Aphasia trial, which was all about, of course, getting people to come and join a group. The people that signed up for that, it was much easier for us to sign up people who already had some degree of connection or were strongly motivated to reconnect to people. But the problem, of course, or a problem with stroke, of course, that it is, as I said in my talk, it's life shattering, and the impact on confidence of stroke survivors, and for us particularly people with aphasia, is so great that actually taking that step to engage with one of these therapies is a real challenge. And we come up with solutions, interventions, and we think, oh, this would be great, it's going to work, and this and the other. But actually, if you can't engage the right people and the people that really need it in your program, then it's not going to help, is it? So it's a real challenge.
And then Maggie, finally, I mean, one of the slides that you showed was your stroke research journey from senior training fellowship with us in 2012 right through to Heads Up, and that I know was just a sort of snapshot of your work. I know you've done all sorts of research in other areas. So what would you say has been the biggest highlight of your research career?
I think really the Heads Up project, actually, because hearing the difference that that has made to people's lives. We undertook the research specifically to look at anxiety and depression and to see if that would help people with these really big, huge problems. But what we hadn't really considered was that that might have other impacts as well. So we've talked a bit tonight about confidence, and confidence is one of the big things to come out of the focus groups that we did at the end. But it's not just confidence in itself, it's what confidence then opens up to people. So people went back to work or stayed in employment instead of maybe having to give up work. People took up new roles, maybe in voluntary work and things like that. So a few people went on to train to be mindfulness instructors. We had, I think over both projects, we've had about 100 participants, and we know of at least 3 who've gone on to train to be mindfulness teachers. And people have taken up education, so somebody's gone back to university to learn how to be a counsellor. So these things are really positive, and they were sort of unlooked for as direct outcomes of the research.
So great.
Yeah.
With unintended benefits.
Yeah.
That's just fantastic. Great. Good. So over to the audience. Any questions from people in the audience? Yes. So I'm going to go with the lady in the cream dress.
Thank you. I've got a question for Jason. Very fascinating, interesting and moving talk. Thank you. Do you have any good advice for family members who are maybe dealing with somebody close to them who's had a stroke? Are there any words of wisdom there?
Yeah, I think so. Kind of treat them as, not as if it hadn't happened, but treat them as much as normal as possible, because actually there's this whole treading on eggshells things, which is like, don't upset dad because he doesn't like noise now, or you better not have a normal family argument about the remote control or someone going out on a Friday night because dad will be upset and he might have another stroke. I craved normality, and as much as they annoy me a lot, I do really love them. And actually I kind of had to have that chat, which was like, it's okay. I know I am more irritable than before, which is one of the factors of having had a stroke. Like all of the previous stuff I said was magnified. I was a bit irritable beforehand, and I was more irritable. And so they probably got the back end of that kind of stuff, and they were very kind in accepting all that kind of stuff. But I craved the normality.
So thanks a lot for all of your talks. I mean, it's really important to highlight the unseen symptoms of stroke, because it's obviously it's very neglected. But my question, I guess, to all of you is, do you, when you're thinking about anxiety and depression, do you think about primary and secondary causes when it comes to thinking about how to treat them? Because you could think about primary causes as being underlying biological causes as a result of acquired brain injury itself, and a secondary cause might be something that Jason alluded to, and many people in the room would have experienced, that sense of abandonment after you leave hospital, that idea that you ought to have more access to rehabilitation but you're not getting it, and somehow there's a mismatch between what you're achieving and what you ought to be achieving and what you're achieving. So do you think about the primary and secondary causes, and in terms of how you might approach treating those different cases?
Complex question, Nick. So should we just get a couple of reflections from one or two of you? Yeah.
So when we first were thinking about a heads up, we had lots of discussions about, well, I suppose our discussions were around, do we have to be sure that the person who takes part in the research, who has anxiety and or depression, that those states have come about as a result of the stroke? Or could it be that they had anxiety and depression previously? And so we didn't look at, I guess what we did, this was always thought of as a community project, as a community intervention. So somebody who'd been for years after a stroke and didn't have any support and saw advertised in their local community hall, there's a mindfulness course, you can go along to it. That was the kind of person we were looking at. So in the end, we decided that what we would have to say is that the person would self-diagnose, if you like, as having had a stroke, and they would also more or less self-diagnose as having a mental health disorder. So we haven't measured anything formally in that way or clinically. It's very much about been living with stroke for years, still anxious, depressed, whatever, it's impacting my life. I could do this thing, it might make a difference.
I just found that everything was amplified. So I was probably a child that was slightly morose and anxious, and those things were just amplified after this thing had happened. So I could always tell you 20 reasons why I couldn't do something before all of this happened. And it's just that I now had more factual things that blew up with it.
I think there's a really interesting circular symbiotic relationship between having depression and then feeling it exacerbates itself sometimes. And so in a way, for me, it doesn't really matter what the cause of it is. We're treating a person who's coming to us saying, I feel sad and I want some help. And I don't think, obviously, apart from, I don't know much about the biological consequences or when we should medicate. That's not where I work. But for us, it's same as you. It's about someone saying, I'm in a difficult place and I would like some support. And then I think that's why really research needs to be following people up for longer, looking at lots of the different factors that might affect the causal relationships between mood problems and then how they're living their life and whatnot, and follow them up for longer to see if we're actually preventing further crises down the line. That's what needs to happen. But usually research projects are so short-term follow-ups that it might not give us that sort of insight.
And I think it's fair to say that at the moment we don't really know what's the causal relationship between the brain damage and then just a normal psychological response to such a sort of challenging event.
Yeah.
And I think, it's a sort of an area where we do need to do more research. So I think we've got time for one last question, if we may. Hello, Kate.
Hello, thank you for having me here this evening. Really appreciate the great talks. My question is actually for Emma, and it's around the inclusion elements of your project. I was really glad Julia asked that question about how you were, and you responded very well about how you were going to include people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. But it struck me that you did a fantastic job of delivering research during COVID, and a lot of it was on Zoom. And I just wondered about the social isolation elements, and have you thought about, an intervention that's been delivered on Zoom, how are you going to reach communities where they are not so easily online and able to access that sort of intervention? So I just wondered what you were thinking around that.
Yeah, definitely. I think the whole landscape of health inequalities after stroke is huge, and we talked about this. Digital inclusion is an issue for both of our pieces of work that's moved online essentially. And I suppose the honest answer is that it's not one of the primary things that we're looking at, but of course it would get in the way of us being able to deliver a research project like this successfully. So it's something that we're going to probe and explore. But I think, as Mark said, we really need a whole buffet of interventions to offer people in person, because some people actually prefer to do things online these days, don't they? So I think we have to just acknowledge that we can't do everything, and that this is going to be something that if you don't have access to the internet, you might not be able to do this. But we're going to try and speak to those sort of people and see what we could be offering them. But it's absolutely, it's a really big issue for sure.
Great. So thank you very much, our amazing speakers. So that's the end of the Q&A. So thank you. So I'm afraid you've got to put up with a few words from me, if you don't mind. So I think these really were great talks. So I think one of the big themes that came out from all of those talks is how committed we are at the Stroke Association to really listening and acting on the priorities that matter to stroke survivors and their carers. And in 2021, we led a project called the Priority Setting Partnership to understand the key priorities and the key unanswered questions in stroke research. And stroke survivors, carers, and healthcare professionals told us that their number one priority for research in the post-acute pathway was understanding more about the mental and emotional challenges caused by stroke. Now, we really weren't altogether surprised that that was the number one priority. We know that stroke happens in an instant. You have absolutely no time to prepare. And the impact of coming to terms with a whole new life can really be quite traumatic. And we know this thanks to detailed insights into the lived experience of research, which we gathered through a research project with over 11,000 stroke survivors and their carers in 2018. And that survey told us that 3/4 of stroke survivors experience challenges with their mental health. Nearly half of stroke survivors reported anxiety, another half reported depression, and heartbreakingly, nearly 1 in 5 stroke survivors said that they'd experienced suicidal thoughts. And the research also told us that carers really struggle too, and we've heard that tonight. Carers reported exhaustion, anxiety, sadness, and stress, with negative emotions sadly increasing over time. So this is a very real problem that needs to be addressed. So I'd just like to say, Jason, I mean, thank you so much for sharing your story tonight. It really was very, very poignant and moving. And I know what bravery that takes. And I know you don't want me to say that, but, you know, doing it publicly is hard. Yeah, it's hard enough to tell your family and your friends, isn't it, when you're struggling with mental ill health. And I have to say, I'd like to say thank you to all the stroke survivors and their loved ones who participate in the research projects that are showcased tonight. But there are also hundreds of other stroke survivors who use their lived experience week in, week out to shape research processes or become research participants. Without them, it would just be too easy to ask the wrong kinds of questions or draw unfounded conclusions. Their willingness to share means that we and our researchers can gain a deeper understanding of what really works and why. Now, research and evaluation do inform everything that we do as a charity. They inform how we design and deliver the services that help people to rebuild their lives after stroke. From our stroke helpline and trusted information through to the in-person support that's provided by our stroke coordinators and our fantastic network of stroke groups across the UK, these services just would not be possible without research, insights, and feedback, which we collect from tens of thousands of stroke survivors and their carers. I hope that tonight has helped to highlight the incredible value and benefits of stroke research. It's fair to say that we've come an awfully long way since we first started funding research in the 1980s. Advances in stroke medicine, like the FAST campaign, specialist stroke units, thrombolysis and thrombectomy, many of which have been pump primed by the Stroke Association, are achievements to be really proud of. And the evidence base for making stroke preventable, treatable, and recoverable grows all the time. And we saw that only last week with the recently updated National Clinical Guideline for Stroke that now covers the whole of the UK and the Republic of Ireland, thanks in part to funding from the Stroke Association. But as tonight has also highlighted, there are still many unanswered questions when it comes to the best way to support psychological and emotional well-being after a stroke. Our priority setting partnership revealed many questions still to be answered, including what interventions can best prevent psychological difficulties? How can we support adjustment? How can we improve well-being? How cost-effective are these interventions? And how can they be made available to more people affected by stroke? As the only UK charity dedicated solely to funding stroke research, we're uniquely placed to support the best researchers, the best ideas, and the best innovations that can address some of these important questions. You've heard from some of our brilliant researchers tonight, and they really are brilliant. And we're incredibly proud to be part of our stroke research community and to nurture the brightest minds in the field. We fund people and projects that help make this happen. But at the heart of all of this is the voice of lived experience, which keeps us grounded, and it makes sure that the research that we fund has the potential to make a real tangible difference to stroke survivors. Now, unfortunately, as you may have heard me say before, stroke research is chronically underfunded. Each year in the UK, charities and government bodies spend a record £483 million on cancer research, and they spend £248 million on neurological conditions like dementia. And yet the annual spend on stroke research is only £30 million. So that works out to only £23 per stroke survivor compared to £161 per cancer survivor. And there's two consequences to this underfunding. The first is that important research questions, which could really help improve people's quality of life, go unanswered for too long. The second is that we do lose people working in stroke research because of a shortage of funding and career development opportunities. Unfortunately, stroke research has what we call a leaky pipeline. Between PhD student and professor, we lose many talented, experienced academics, either to other careers or other disciplines. And the people who are able to stay are more likely to be white and male than the people we lose. And in losing researchers, we not only lose their knowledge and skills, but also their valuable personal perspective. So as the Stroke Association, we have to be smart about how we fund research, because we know we want it to make the biggest impact. And we have to try and grow the overall amount spent on stroke research for the future. So one way we do this is to put plugs into the leaky pipeline. We want to build and support an expert stroke research community. So our research funding is focused on building capability in all the disciplines where stroke research happens, from computer science right through to biochemistry. Most of our research grants go to people in the early and mid stages of their careers, and that's where it's often hardest to get funding. And we hope that we develop mutually supportive relationships with researchers, providing assistance with networking, knowledge transfer, and other useful skills. And I hope you believe that it works, because as we've heard tonight from Emma and Professor Lawson, they're two wonderful examples of people who've kept coming back to us at different stages of their career. We also work hard to leverage funding and raise the profile of stroke research. So we partner with organisations with shared interests. So one of our partners is SBRI Healthcare, and they've co-funded research grants on new technologies that can help improve stroke diagnosis and rehabilitation. And we're going to hear shortly about some of the awards that funding is giving us the opportunity to create. And our partnership work's been hugely successful. In the last year, for every £1 that the Stroke Association has invested in our research partnerships, we've managed to leverage an additional £11.80 in funding, amounting to around £7.6 million of additional funds that have been brought by partners into stroke research. So I hope you agree that represents, I think, pretty good value for money. So it's clear that the future of stroke research is bright. And in a few minutes, we're going to be announcing some new research grants that we've funded this year. And you're going to see that they cover all stages of the stroke pathway, and they range from finding better ways to identify who's at risk of stroke to using artificial intelligence to really personalising rehab after stroke. So I want to thank you all, whether you're a stroke survivor sharing your experience to help shape research, a healthcare professional on the front line of treatment, a researcher hard at work, trialing a new drug or a rehab technique, a funding partner who's helped us to invest in stroke research, a political ally using your influence to help ensure our research findings make it into practice, or anyone else who's supported us or is considering doing so. We really do thank you. By pooling our funding, talents, and expertise, I'm confident that together we can fulfill our vision of there being fewer strokes and everyone affected by stroke getting the help they need to live the best life that they can. And I do especially want to thank our donors. I want to thank our donors who are online, those of you who are in the audience. Without you, we wouldn't have been able to fund the amazing research that you've heard about tonight. So please do continue to support us. Not only do you fund our work directly, but you also help to underline our credibility as a research funder, and you're helping us to leverage significantly more funding into stroke research. So thank you. So we're on to the final bit of tonight, which is announcing some exciting research awards. So some of the individuals are physically in the room with us tonight. So please do say hello to them and congratulate them if you're staying for the drinks reception. So I'm going to run through a very long list of very deserving research award participants. I apologize in advance if I get the pronunciation of any of the names wrong, and I apologize in advance because I'm going to summarize what are very complex research projects in just a few words, and I'm sure I'm going to misrepresent these research projects that go well beyond my O-level science credentials, so I apologize in advance. So let's go for the list. So we're announcing tonight 2 postgraduate fellowship awards. So that's Carrie Corley, who's doing research into the much neglected area of aphasia post-stroke, and Margherita Santorini, who's looking into artificial intelligence and how that can help predict language recovery after stroke. So we're announcing 1 postdoctoral fellowship award, and that goes to Claudia Bruns. And that's again for more research into post-stroke aphasia. We're announcing 1 non-clinical lectureship award, and that goes to Dr. Kieran South, and that's looking at stroke research caused by common peripheral inflammatory diseases. So next we move on to the Senior Clinical Lectureship Award, which goes to Dr. Nicholas Evans, and Nicholas will be looking at frailty and the effects on stroke treatment and outcomes. And now we move on to all of the Stroke Association Stroke and Technology Awards that are being funded by SBRI Healthcare. So the first award goes to Professor Michael Warner from Sonalis Imaging, who's looking at a type of ultrasound to accelerate stroke diagnosis and triage. The next award goes to Dr. Eduardo Gaude from Pocket Diagnostics, who's looking at a point-of-care blood test to identify pre-hospital strokes suitable for thrombectomy. Then Professor Lord Aradazi is looking at a digital system for upper limb rehabilitation. Daisy Allington from Cognitant is looking at a personalised digital support package. Dr. Evridiki Gregorio from Neurovert is looking at immersive virtual rehabilitation for post-stroke rehabilitation. David Freed from Evolve Rehabilitation Technologies is looking at exergaming, so exercise gaming using a virtual platform. And Dr. Earl Merson from Oddstock Medical is looking at a neuromuscular stimulator. And then finally, our much deserving recipients of our project grants. So the first goes to Alan Cameron, who's looking at the role of blood, ECG, and genetic biomarkers in atrial fibrillation screening. Next, Professor Philip James from Predict EV, who's looking at the association of extracellular vesicles and dysregulated coagulation in the prediction of stroke. I hope some of you understand. I think it's something to do with the blood. Then we go on to Professor Antonio Belli, He's looking at the golden hour for stroke. I think we can all identify with that one. Professor Adam Gordon, who's looking at telerehabilitation and stroke care. And Professor Audrey Bowen, who's in the audience with us tonight, who's looking at upskilling a workforce to deliver inclusive, accessible psychological support. So many congratulations to all of our research awards. Good. So I'd just like to close with some further quick thank yous. So thank you to Victoria. It's been absolutely great having you host tonight. Thank you ever so much, and for sharing your and your family's stroke experience. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you to Jason for sharing his story. It really was poignant. I think there was so much of what you said resonated with all of us in the room. So thank you. And then thank you to our amazing researchers, Professor Mark Tarrant, Professor Maggie Lawrence, and Dr. Emma Patchwood for your talks. You really have shown us the need to deepen our understanding into the psychological and emotional impacts of stroke, and to understand what interventions really work for different individuals. So thank you. And lastly, thanks to everybody in the audience. We can't express enough how much we appreciate the gifts that you give us. Your time, your voice, and your money. Your support really helps us to help more people affected by stroke to rebuild their lives. So I'm just going to finish by saying good night. Good night to everyone online. And if you're staying with us, do enjoy the opportunity to network and have some food and drinks with us in the atrium outside. And safe journeys home. Thank you.